Chapter 45. Coup. It was easy to guess which of these huts housed the village's chief. There were 2 guards posted immediately outside the hut's door. It was a bit of a giveaway, but Reyes was also aware that those 2 guards would be among the best huntresses that the village had to offer. Each of the 2 guards was armed with a short ceremonial spear, and also carried a dart thrower with a small quiver of arrows. It was clear from the way they were standing that neither of them had had any kind of military training, but Reyes really didn't fancy going up against either of them if he had any choice. Perhaps he had been staring at the 2 guards for too long, but suddenly Gaggara grabbed him by the wrist and dragged him towards the back end of the chief's hut. Between the chief's hut and the next nearest hut, a small group of very young harpies had prepared a small fire and were desperately trying to get some sort of flame. All the wood in the area had been soaked through during the night's downpour. It looked like the girls were fighting a losing battle. That went better than expected, Gaggara was speaking, ignoring those by the fire and turning so that she was face to face with her male. It went better than I expected, Reyes agreed. He glanced back over his shoulder. His sister was still standing over by the wooden cage where he had first seen her. She was looking more than a little helpless. He would have loved to have spoken to her, to have said anything in the hope that he might somehow raise her spirits by his mere presence. He would free her soon. He would free all the prisoners soon. Even in the few seconds he looked towards his sister, he realised that he would have to hurry if he truly wished to free all the other prisoners as well. The elves had opened the cage and were gathering the inmates in a group just outside the bars. By the look of it, they were planning to take the prisoners with them. Gaggara's voice brought Reyes back to the situation at hand. In many villages they would have shut us down before we'd gotten close enough to land. It's often only when a village is low on huntresses that they become willing to open themselves to new blood. We were very lucky, Reyes accepted. They do seem to be a lot more laid back here. Did you see the young male out in the open like that? He was in full view of everyone else in the village. That is a child who has been accepted by the chief as his eventual replacement. Reyes then quickly switched to flourish. He knew that Gaggara with her medallion would still understand him, whereas anyone else listening wouldn't have a clue what he was saying. It almost makes me want to think twice about what I have to do here. You want us to leave? Gaggara asked doubtfully. Reyes looked at her and shook his head. I can't leave my sister behind. I also have a responsibility to rescue the prince. I'm just beginning to wish it wasn't this village. Gaggara looked around quickly, checking her surroundings, and then she whispered at a volume so quiet that it would be virtually impossible for any of the other villagers to hear what she had said. Even Reyes, standing right next to her, barely heard her. What's the plan? Reyes turned and looked at the rear of the chief's hut. He took a step towards it, and crouched down next to the rough thatch-covered wall and stroked it with the palm of his hand. A spray of rainwater sloshed off the wall and hit the floor beside him. A few stray droplets struck his knees, giving him a rather unpleasant surprise. That water was still very cold. Reyes climbed back to his feet and stepped back away from the hut before anyone got too suspicious. He spoke in flourish still, and tried to emulate the volume at which Gaggara had spoken in the hope that only she would hear his words. I have a spell that can start small fires. I was hoping to set fire to the back of the hut and so flush the male out, but the roof of the hut is far too damp. We need to think of something else, Gaggara whispered back. We do, Reyes agreed. Besides, Gaggara voiced, your spell would have been a little too obvious. She jerked her head backwards, indicating the small group of girls who were still trying to get the fire lit behind them. Reyes glanced over at the young harpies. He smiled grimly to himself. They would have seen everything. Even though they appeared to be concentrating totally on getting their fire lit, Reyes had little doubt they were keeping an eye on the 2 newcomers, and were almost certainly wondering why they were lurking at the rear of the chief's hut, apparently conspiring with each other. Reyes imagined that there weren't many things that would look more suspicious. Reyes beckoned Gaggara to follow and stepped away from the chief's hut. Together they walked a short distance to the next nearest hut. The chief's hut, such as it was, had probably been the first to be constructed. From there, the harpies had worked outwards, so that every one of the huts closest to the chief's hut was also complete. With Gaggara in tow, Reyes reached the next hut fairly quickly. He walked around the edge of the hut. He had chosen this hut carefully. From the right position, it gave him a perfect view of one of the 2 guards standing in front of the chief's hut, without that guard being able to see him. At the same time, the hut hid both him and Gaggara from the girls trying to light the fire. What are you thinking? Gaggara asked in a whisper. All this creeping around must look very suspicious. Race looked quickly at his surroundings. He could see a couple of harpies in the air flying lazily overhead, and there was another working on the roof of a hut about 50 yards from them. That was all he could see. Race had no doubt there were others who could see him, but at the moment he couldn't see them. "Is it true," Race asked, keeping his voice as quiet as he could bear, "that the main reason you think of me as your male is because we mated?" "Yes," Gaggara said uncertainly. "It's true then that male harpies use the act of procreation to claim the loyalty of their female subjects," Race said. "Well, yes," Gaggara said, and then dropping her voice back to its barely audible whisper, she added, "But don't worry, you won't have to sleep with everyone in the village to gain their loyalty. As long as you dispose of the current chief in a fair challenge, you win their loyalty by proxy." "So, as long as they are loyal to him, they'll be loyal to me?" Race asked. "So to speak," Gaggara commented. "So to speak?" Race questioned. "Even the most loyal of huntresses might consider betraying her male if she thinks she'll gain from doing so. It's not unheard of for a group of huntresses to plot to replace their male totally, especially if they think their current chief is bad for the village," Gaggara explained. "It's rare. A harpy needs to be pretty sure of herself before she'll try any such thing, but it's not unheard of." "So, not really loyal," Race replied. "Loyal enough," Gaggara remarked. Race nodded uncertainly, then he glanced over at the nearest of the two guards standing by the chief's hut. "I think we may have a way in." "We do?" Gaggara questioned. "We do," Race assured her. His instinct was to take the Major's staff from the hammerstone, but if he was being watched, it was unlikely that such an action would go unnoticed. Instead, he was going to have to cast his spell without its benefit. From where he was standing, he could only see one of the two guards. Ideally, he would have preferred to get a little bit closer, but that would almost certainly alert the guard, if not the entire village. Ideally, he would like to cast his spell on this guard, and then make his way around to a position where he could cast his spell on the second guard. But there was no obvious vantage point on that second guard close enough for the spell to work without the entire village becoming alerted to his intent. Race had to hope that bewitching the first guard would be enough. At least the spell he had in mind was an easy one to cast. It required a few words which Race could say at such a low volume that even Gaggara might have trouble hearing them. The words could be spoken in flourish, so Race wouldn't have to fret about remembering the charm. The only real downside was that it also required a couple of arm movements, but even they could be made subtly. "Is that it?" Gaggara asked. She sounded a little disappointed, as if she'd been expecting a loud bang of some kind. "What did it do?" From the outward appearance, nothing had changed. The guard was still standing exactly where she had been, and by the look of it, she didn't even seem to realise that a spell of any kind had been cast on her. Race couldn't help himself. He looked around nervously. Had anyone seen him cast that spell? There seemed to be no repercussions. The harpy on the hut roof was too busy hammering at something to even have noticed what Race had done. No one else seemed any the wiser. Confident that he had somehow gotten away with casting the spell, Race steeled himself for the next part of his plan. He stepped out and approached the guard, certain that the entire village would immediately become alert to his intent. "No entry," the harpy guarding the door spoke sharply. She made a point of unsheathing her claws as she looked at Race and Gaggara in turn. It wasn't a good start, and it made Race wonder if his spell had even taken hold. He seemed to have a little choice, though. He decided to press forward. "My sister and I are new to this village." "I know," the harpy commented coldly. "In order to ensure our loyalty to the village, your leader," quickly Race corrected himself, "our leader, wants us to mate with the chief." The guard looked at Race and then at Gaggara, her eyes settling on Gaggara's stomach and the bulge of her pregnancy. Then her eyes moved back to Race, and she sniffed the air. "You are not ready. Your sister is already carrying, and the male already has a mate. You may not enter." Race felt frozen with fear for a moment. His spell hadn't worked. Or maybe it had, since all it did was act on an existing relationship to make the victim of the spell more susceptible to suggestion. Since Race and the guard on the door had no kind of relationship before today, the spell might simply have had nothing to work with. Elsewhere in the village, the harpies had become alert to Race and Gaggara hovering near the chief's hut. The two guards seemed relatively calm by comparison. Perhaps they were confident of their abilities, sure that they could defend the door to the hut until help arrived. Race tried to think quickly. Nothing he had thought of was working. The rain made everything too wet to use a tinderbox spell. His relationship with his harpy was too weak for his convince spell, and he was loath to bring out his sword and cut down the two guards who were, after all, only doing their job, and who he might find useful when he took over. "Go to sleep," Reyes told the guard. He felt a little uncertain about using the spell, as it had failed him once before, but the guard slumped to the floor with a surprised grunt and was snoring before she had properly settled. The second guard moved very quickly. She levelled her spear at Gaggara and was in mid-thrust before Reyes managed to get his 3 little words out. The guard toppled forward, the tip of her spear striking Gaggara on the left side of her chest, causing a trickle of blood to emerge. But then the guard dropped the spear and fell asleep on her front. Gaggara grabbed hold of the spear and the guard had just dropped. She lifted it quickly and reversed it. Then she began to bring it down hard and fast towards one of the sleeping guards. Reyes stopped her. He knocked the spear to one side so that Gaggara's thrust hit the ground rather than the guard's inert form. "No!" Gaggara looked a little hurt as she glanced at Reyes. "She's not the enemy," Reyes declared. "Come on." Gaggara left the spear sticking out of the ground and followed Reyes into the hut. As with Gaggara's hut back in Harpy Town, they had to crouch to get through the doorway. It was dark in the hut, very dark. The walls of this hut were so carefully sealed to stop anything from getting in that even the slightest hint of sunlight didn't seem to be able to get in through the gaps. There were 2 residents in the hut already. Reyes knew this because a moment after he entered, one of them lit an old oil lantern illuminating the interior. The hut was made from a simple design. Reyes was certain that a lot more wood had gone into the construction of this hut than any of those he had seen in Harpy Town. This hut also didn't have a support pillar, as Gaggara's hut had had. Instead of straw on the floor, there were a large number of animal skins of various types. Most of them were quite old and threadbare in many places, but a few of the skins seemed to be relatively new. To one side of the hut was a bale of hay on which was sitting the bones left over from yesterday's meal. The place did stink, but it stank with the sweet smell of perfume. It was as if the very air had been saturated with stuff, and Reyes wondered if there might be an aphrodisiac element to the perfume. The chief was looking quite old for a harpy. He was probably somewhere in his mid-20s. To some extent, that explained to Reyes why he'd allowed a male child to be raised. The chief maybe had 4 or 5 more years before he reached 30, and the boy probably had 4 or 5 years before he came of age. The girl, on the other hand, didn't look as if she was all that much older than either Reyes or Gaggara. She cowered in the corner, covering herself with the nearest animal skin as if that might somehow afford her some minor protection. Both the chief and his guests were covered in bite marks. "What's going on?" the male insisted angrily, climbing slowly to his feet. "How dare you barge in here? I'll have you both killed for this." Reyes stared the chief down. "I'm here to challenge you for the leadership of your village." The chief looked at Reyes up and down and laughed. "You? Only a male can challenge for the leadership of a village." Reyes glanced down at himself and smiled. Then he willed himself back into his male appearance. "I am male." Reyes then thrust his hand forward, willing his sword into his hand in mid-thrust. The blade found the chief totally unprepared for the attack. For the briefest of moments, the chief looked down at the blade protruding from his belly, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then he let out an almost childlike squeal. This had been easier than expected. Had Reyes known it would be so easy to get in here and kill the male, he would have made a beeline straight for the hut, instead of all that mucking around trying to find a way to thrust the male out. Since it had been so easy, it worried Reyes as to how secure his own tenure as chief would be. He had to remind himself that magic was rare among harpies, and even though he was male, he was quite capable of defending himself. It was unusual among harpies for a male to be able to fight. They only had to answer challenges, and then, very rarely, only if the girls of his village weren't able to stop the challenger from reaching him in the first place. As a result, the chief of a harpy village was never really taught how to fight properly. Nevertheless, Reyes had expected the chief to put up a better defence than he had. Reyes tried to retrieve his sword, but it was stuck. He pulled hard, but the weapon wasn't budging. Reyes had to wheel the blade back into the hammerstone in order to dislodge it from the body. The ex-chief fell to the floor, a pool of blood emerging from his corpse and beginning to stain some of the nearby animal skins. Gaggara rounded on the girl in the hut. "You." She spoke firmly, her voice filled with authority, as if she was taking it as read that she was going to be the village leader from now on. Your sisters are outside even now, waiting for us to emerge so they can fill us full of arrows. Gaggara pointed at the recently killed chief. I want you to take her body outside and tell your sisters that there has been a change in the chief of the village. Reyes nodded. Make sure your sisters are aware that I am male, whatever they may have thought. Be clear as to what has happened here. I don't want there to be any misunderstanding when Gaggara and I emerge. Then Gaggara offered. Tell them that their new chief plans to address the entire village 10 minutes from now, and that everyone not actively out hunting needs to attend. Tell them that their new chief expects the loyalty that is her due. 10 minutes, Reyes said, glancing warily at Gaggara. You need to establish your claim quickly, handsome, Gaggara told him. Reyes nodded, though he felt a little uncertain. He had just killed the chief of the village, and now he had to expose himself to the huntresses of that same village. He would have preferred to wait a while and give the villagers a chance to get used to the idea of a new chief. Then again, he needed to hurry to save his sister and the other prisoners, and 10 minutes might be too late. Tell them, Reyes said, that none of the elves or their prisoners are to leave the village until I give the say-so. If they have already left, bring them and their prisoners back. The girl climbed slowly and nervously to her feet. She looked uncertainly at Reyes and then at the corpse of her recent lover. But if I go out there, they'll kill me for not having defended the chief with all my ability. They won't kill you, Reyes said sternly. I am the chief now. Make sure they are aware that only I will say who is to live and who is to die. Do as I tell you, show your loyalty to me, and no harm will befall you. Your new chief will protect you, Gaggara added. The harpy picked up the corpse and made her way over to the door and out of the hut. Reyes glanced at the blood-stained animal skin. He would have to get that chucked and maybe some of the others that were looking too old. He settled down on the floor of the hut on one of the animal skins and beckoned to Gaggara to join him. Well, he said, that's it, the village is ours. Now you can free your sister, Gaggara commented. Indeed, Reyes said, kissing Gaggara on the side of her face. Thank you for being there for me. I am yours, Gaggara said, and I will be the leader of this village. It's what I've always wanted, she smiled. I've never even been a village harpy before. Reyes smiled back. Just so long as you know, I plan to remain devoted to you. I will not mate with any of the others. I may adopt that young boy as my heir, then I'll step down peacefully for her when she comes of age. I really only came here to rescue my sister, but I do feel a kind of responsibility to them, since I killed their male. I understand, Gaggara said. It'll give us a few years in charge, judging by her age. Although, if and when you do step down for her, you'll probably have to flee the village. You would still be young enough to be perceived as a threat. Reyes nodded. It was a shame I had to kill their male. I never really wanted control of an entire village. Well, Gaggara said happily, I plan to enjoy it. Reyes nodded understanding, and he couldn't resist the urge for a quick laugh. What is it? Gaggara asked. Knowing how much Greyforth loves harpies, Reyes told her. I wonder how she's going to react when we return with an entire village under our control.